When analyzing an argument, it is important to recognize the information that you do not know. When analyzing an argument, there's going to be a little bit of information that you do know and a lot of information that you do not know. So it is important to recognize and acknowledge missing links and disconnected information. So let me give you an example of that. Lauren wants to be more productive. Last week, she began getting up earlier. So in a casual conversation, this argument makes perfect sense. Lauren wants to be more productive, so to become more productive, last week she started getting up earlier because it's a common held belief that if you get up earlier, that you'll get more done, and that's true for a lot of people. So that makes sense in a casual conversation. But if you're actually trying to analyze this argument, this does not make sense because there's a disconnect. Remember, you need to acknowledge missing links and disconnected information. These, when it comes down to it, these two sentences are disconnected. There's no link between them. Lauren wants to be more productive is one thought, and the other thought is last week she began getting up earlier. Now, of course, we know that the author or the writer is implying that she started getting up earlier to be more productive, but we really don't know that because it's never stated. So we can't just assume information. We can't just make up links between unrelated concepts unless the writer tells us that we can relate those two concepts to each other. So I'm going to draw a circle here, and everything inside the circle is going to be what we do know, and everything outside the circle is going to be what we don't know. So what do we know? We know Lauren's goal. Lauren's goal is to be more productive. We know that she adjusted wake-up time. And we know when she did it. She adjusted her wake-up time last week. That's all we know. So what are some things that we don't know? We don't know when this new wake-up time is. We just know the wake-up time is earlier, but earlier than what? So this could be 9 a.m. or 3:30 a.m. in the morning. We have no idea. We don't know why she changed the wake-up time. I'll just write why. Is it to be more productive? Maybe she started a new job that requires her to be there early. Maybe she has kids who start getting up earlier. Or maybe the school year started again, so she needs to make sure she's up to get the kids to school on time. We don't know. And another thing we don't know is why does she want to be more productive? That's another why question. Not quite as relevant to what we're talking about, but it's still a valid question. And how does she plan to become more productive? So we can infer here that her plan for being more productive is to get up earlier, but we don't really know that because there's a missing link here. So there's a little bit of information in here that we do know. This is very limited. Information out here is stuff we don't know. These are just some basic things that we don't know. But really, I could fill up this whole whiteboard and hundreds of other whiteboards with things that we don't know. This circle, the info in the circle is never going to get any bigger from these two sentences. But really, there's tons of information we don't know. So remember, when analyzing an argument, you need to remember a little bit of information you do know, a lot that you don't know. So although some assumptions may be fairly reasonable given the information, it is important to understand that they are just assumptions and not, in fact, known. When looking at a passage, it's good to determine the author's main point and their purpose. So another term for main point would be main idea. So basically, this is what the author is trying to convey. It's the most important information that the author is trying to convey to the reader. Then there's purpose. This is why the author is trying to convey the information. So we could say that the main point is the what, and the purpose is the why. Because the purpose is what the author is hoping to achieve by sharing the information with you. So purpose is the why behind the what. Purpose is the reason you're sharing the what. So an example of this would be that an author's main point could be that yellow lights should be longer. And their premises for that, or what backs up their belief about that, is that longer yellow lights will save lives through reduced traffic accidents. So the purpose here, the reason that the author would share this main point with you and the evidence behind it, is to make you also believe that yellow lights should be longer. So that's just an elementary example of that. So we have a passage right here, and we're not going to look for the purpose in this main passage. We're just going to look at the author's main point. So this says, people need to appreciate public schools. The school year should be increased by 2 weeks. This would allow for increased instruction in core subject areas. This would also shorten the summer break, which would lessen the amount of time for students to forget what they learned. So, this first sentence here says, people need to appreciate public schools. So, could that be a conclusion or a main point? Another word for main point is a conclusion. So we have main point, and then I'll put in parentheses here, conclusion. And then we have premises that back up a main point. This is basically kind of the evidence or the reasons behind that main point. So, could this be a main point? Yes, but let's keep moving on and see if that's really the main point of this passage. The next sentence says, the school year should be increased by 2 weeks. Could that be a main point? Absolutely. Now, remember, a main point needs to have premises, things to back it up, facts, figures, arguments, anything like that to back it up. Okay? So, these next two sentences talk about why it'd be good to increase the school year by 2 weeks. They don't talk about why people need to appreciate public schools more. So these two sentences, these last two sentences are basically premises backing up this sentence right here, saying the school year should be increased by 2 weeks. So this second sentence here is the main point. This first sentence is really a distractor. Now, in kind of a roundabout way, if the school year was increased by 2 weeks, then maybe people would begin to appreciate public schools more and begin to appreciate all that they're teaching children. But that's kind of a roundabout way, and these two premises right here relate more directly to this sentence here than they do this first sentence. So, premises can be thought of as the foundations or the building blocks for the main point. Without premises, a main point crumbles because there's nothing to back it up. So you have to have those premises. So that's a look at author's main point or purpose. Causality basically refers to cause and effect. But before we go too far into a definition of causality, let's go ahead and dive into an example. When the Hamels went out of town, Karen was supposed to come over every morning and evening to take care of the dog. When the Hamels returned, the dog was visibly underfed. Karen must have forgotten to feed the dog. So causality is about relationships, a relationship between A and B. So B is the event that we know occurred, and A is the event that is believed to have caused B. So in this case, the event that we know occurred is the fact that the Hamels dog is underfed. So this is B. So the question is, what caused B? Right now, it is believed that it's because Karen forgot to feed the dog. So that is A. So we have to ask ourselves, is it possible that A caused B? Absolutely. But then we have to go further and ask ourselves, is it probable? Well, we don't know yet because there's so many other factors that could have caused B. For example, maybe Karen went over to feed the dog every day, but a lot of dogs act differently when their owners aren't around, and so maybe the dog didn't eat very much. Or maybe the food bowl is on the back porch and other animals came up and ate out of the food bowl. This would be very probable because since the Hamels were out of town, there wasn't much human activity to deter animals coming up to the back porch. Or maybe Karen went over there and fed the dog every day, but the Hamels forgot to leave directions as to how many scoops of dog food to give the dog each day. And so Karen only gave the dog 1 scoop of food when really the dog required 2 or maybe even 3 scoops of food. So as you can see here, there's not enough evidence to say rationally, or really it's not rational at this point to say that it A caused B. But now we come across some new information. It says, when Karen took care of my cats, I came home to find my cats starving. Karen said that she forgot to come over most days. So this changes some things because it gives us some new information. Now the idea that A caused B is becoming more probable. But we still don't know for certain because Karen was taking care of cats here. Maybe Karen isn't a big fan of cats, and so since she's not a big fan of cats, she just kind of forgot to go and feed them. But maybe she loves dogs, and so she would never forget to go feed dogs. Or maybe this was 10 years ago, and so Karen's grown up and matured and learned a lot since then, and so now she doesn't forget to feed animals. Or maybe because she made this mistake in the past, she has all the more resolve to make sure she doesn't forget to feed animals. The point here is that while it's still possible that A caused B and it's becoming more and more probable, we can't just say it's probable that A caused B because there's so many things that we do not know. But now we come across some more information. Karen told me that she was not concerned if she forgot to feed the dog. I was with her on vacation for 2 full days. Now this completely changes things because we have this new information that's saying that Karen wasn't even concerned if she forgot to feed the dog. If you're not concerned about something, you may forget to do something. And then also if she's not concerned about feeding the dog, that means if she realized she forgot to feed the dog, she wouldn't go back over to the Hamels to feed him. And this person was with her on vacation for 2 full days. So there's no way that Karen could have been feeding the dogs for those 2 full days. Assuming that this comes from a reliable source, this changes things a lot because before we were saying it's possible that A caused B, but now we can say it's probable that A caused B. Before, it would not be rational to say A caused B, but now with all this information, it'd be irrational to say that A did not cause B. Of course, there's lots of information we do not know. There could have been other things that occurred that we're not aware of, so we can't say for certain that A caused B, but now it's highly probable. So that's a look at causality. Examining causation should help you determine the relative strength or weakness of a particular argument. So say, for example, that someone says that A caused B. And maybe it's very likely that A did indeed cause B. However, we do not know that for sure because the only thing we know for certain is that B occurred because we can see that B occurred. However, we don't know what caused B. So although it's likely that A caused B, there's a number of other possible factors that could have caused B. So let me give you a practical example. Someone is in a car wreck, and then a few days later, they develop neck pain. So we could say then that the car wreck caused the neck pain. So this is a very strong argument. It's very likely that the car wreck did indeed cause the neck pain. It's very common for people in car wrecks to have neck pain. However, do we know this for certain? No, because there's a number of other factors to take into account. This person who was in the car wreck is an athlete. They enjoy playing basketball. So how do we know that they didn't bump into someone else and jerk their neck a little bit? And this person also has some medical conditions that have caused them to have neck pain in the past. This person also goes to the gym a lot to work out. And so maybe they were working on some of their upper back muscles and strained their neck. So as you can see, the car wreck is the most likely cause of the neck pain, but there's a number of other potential factors that could have caused this neck pain. So let's look at this first statement here. Andy didn't want a child. Because of that, he murdered his only son. So this first statement here is true. Andy didn't want a child. But can we determine from this first sentence that because his son is dead, that Andy murdered his son? As you can see, there's a lot of weak links here. How do we know Andy's feelings about the child? Well, he didn't want a child to begin with, but now that he has a child, he may enjoy having a child around. Or even if he still doesn't want a child, does that necessarily mean that he's going to murder his son? Is that common for people who don't want a child to murder their child? No, not at all. So there's lots of weak links here. And is there any concrete evidence here that suggests that Andy is the perpetrator? So lots of weak links here, and so we can't necessarily say that A caused B here. We know that B occurred. We know that his son was murdered, but we don't know who caused that murder. The second statement says, because Andy was tortured for many years in a POW camp, he was mentally unstable. This is a much stronger argument. Now, the statement is not 100% conclusive, but there's a stronger case here for cause and effect. Andy could be genetically predisposed to psychological problems. However, one would reason that years of torture would probably cause psychological problems. It would cause mental problems. So one thing that's important to look at when looking at causation is try to determine how many other possible causes for the outcome you can think of. If you can think of many other possible causes for the outcome, the causal relationship is weak, and any resulting conclusions should be questioned. However, if few other possibilities come to mind, then the causation is somewhat strong. Up here on the board we have two examples. In each of these examples we need to find the term that does not belong. So here we have oak, canary, pine, and maple. So if there's one term that does not belong, that means there's going to be three terms that do belong or have something in common with each other. So we need to identify the common ground here. So we can notice that oak, pine, and maple are all types of trees. So because we found the common ground, we can quickly identify that canary is the term that does not belong. Now over in example 2, we have pine, maple, tree, and oak. So the common ground here is types of trees. So pine, maple, and oak are all types of trees, and then we have C, which says tree. So we may think that there's no term that does not belong here because these all relate to trees. However, C, tree, does not belong in this because you want to watch out for generic terms. So 3 of these answer choices, A, B, and D, all provide specific examples of types of trees. However, tree is the more generic term. It describes the category of these other 3 terms. So tree does not belong. Up here on the board is an analogy. Antique is to historic as unique is to blank. So first, we need to determine the relationship between antique and historic. So the relationship here is that they are synonyms. So we need to find a synonym for the word unique. We have 4 options: fascinating, inimitable, appealing, and interesting. So most likely the most unfamiliar word here is inimitable. But as you look at A, C, and D, fascinating, appealing, and interesting, you realize that all 3 of these are similar words. In other words, these words are synonyms. So there can only be one correct answer here. So if fascinating was the correct answer, then that would mean that interesting and appealing also have to be the correct answers because all 3 of these words mean the same thing. So since these words are similar, we can automatically cross off those answer choices. And so even if we don't know what inimitable means, then we still know that that is the correct answer. So always be looking for similar words. Like if one of your answer choices was odor, and then answer choice B was smell, then you could automatically cross these 2 answer choices off because they mean the same thing. There can only be one correct answer, and so if odor was the correct answer, that would mean that smell also had to be the correct answer, and that can't happen. So we can automatically cross off similar meaning words in these types of questions.
Context. Sometimes when you're reading and you come across a word that you don't know, you can use context clues to make an educated guess as to what the word means. Now when you're looking at the word you don't know, you don't want to just look right before and after the word. You usually want to look at the sentence before and the sentence after. And sometimes you even have to look at the whole paragraph to get an idea of what that unfamiliar word means. Now, there are some clues that we can look at to help determine what the word means. One thing you can look at is a description. Sometimes a sentence or a sentence following or before the unfamiliar word will give you a description. For instance, the green-feathered macaw. Well, you may not know the word macaw, but by seeing green-feathered, you can infer that it is some kind of a bird with green feathers. Another clue you can look at are synonyms. If you hear the soft and supple leather, well, since you have soft here and then supple, both describing leather, you can figure out that supple probably has something to do with being soft. And in reality, it means moldable. It's easily moldable, and it is somewhat soft to be able to do that. We'll go ahead and note that this one was our bird. Now, another clue you can look for are antonyms. Angie is sweet. She doesn't have a malevolent bone in her body. Well, you may not know what malevolent means, but you probably know what sweet means. And if she isn't malevolent and she is sweet, then you can figure out malevolent is something bad, something negative, the opposite of sweet. And in reality, malevolent means evil. Another clue you can look for are definitions. Sometimes the sentence before, after, or part of the same sentence your word is in will just give you the definition of the word. For instance, the echidna, an egg-laying mammal native to Australia, and then they might tell you some interesting fact about the echidna. Well, in commas, right after echidna is the definition of an echidna, an egg-laying mammal native to Australia. So you know what it is right there. The last clue you can look for is tone. Is the rest of this paragraph positive, negative, happy, scared? If you have a paragraph that's all one tone, then the word probably has something to do with that. If it's a scary tone, then this may be a word that it has to do with something scary. If it's positive, it may be a happy kind of word. So you can always take that into consideration whenever you are taking your educated guess. So once you've looked at clues and you've tried to figure out, looking before and after the sentence your word is in, looking at the whole paragraph, seeing if you can find a description, a synonym, an antonym, a definition, or figure out the tone surrounding that unfamiliar word, you want to take a guess as to what the word means. And then you want to reread the sentence to see if it makes sense to you and ask yourself, does it make sense? So if we were to insert bird here, the green-feathered bird, well, if it's something that has feathers and we have bird after it, that makes sense, so that one would work. The soft and supple leather. So if we know it means something else soft, maybe moldable, we could say the soft and moldable leather, the soft and flexible leather. Any kind of word like that that you put in that was similar to soft would work. It would make sense in your sentence. Okay, we were thinking evil here, something the opposite of sweet. Angie is sweet. She doesn't have an evil bone in her body. That makes sense. She is sweet. She doesn't have an evil bone. Now, the echidna sentence is a little different. If they plug in a definition for you, then it's a little harder to check. You would just say an egg-laying mammal native to Australia, and then maybe tell the sentence after that point because the definition's already there for you. There's not really a synonym for echidna or anything else you could have come up with for what that one meant. And once you've checked to make sure they all make sense, then you have a pretty good idea of what that word means. And you can see how using these context clues of looking for a description, a synonym, an antonym, a definition, or the tone of a paragraph can help you figure out that pesky unfamiliar word.
Many times readers come across words that they are unfamiliar with. So it's important that readers understand how to determine the definition of a word based on its context. This means looking at the words around it and how the word is used in the sentence. Let's look at a couple of examples. This first example says, the elderly scholar spent his evenings hunched over arcane text that few other people even knew existed. So the unfamiliar word here is arcane, but you will see that you can pretty much determine the definition of that word based on the words around it. Here we see the word elderly coming before scholar. So if only an elderly scholar would be studying these texts, then it means that it must be some kind of complex subject that only someone who has acquired much knowledge and wisdom would understand. And then we also see that it says that few other people even knew existed. So that means it's something rare or something that only a few people would know about. So here we have easily and quickly determined the definition of arcane. This next sentence says, Ron's fealty to his parents was not shared by Karen, who disobeyed their every command. Now you'll notice here that there's not very many words that tell us the definition of fealty. Instead, we see words that tell us what fealty is not. Because here it says, Karen, who disobeyed their every command. Here, Ron is being contrasted with Karen. So if fealty is not disobeying their every command, then fealty must mean obeying or being faithful to. Because notice here we're seeing that Karen disobeys their every command, but Ron does not. So Ron must mean not disobeying. In other words, it means obeying. So you see here how by looking at context clues, a reader can quickly determine the definition of a word. And although it may not be the exact definition, it generally will be the definition for that word in that particular sentence. And so this can be very helpful because it helps a reader be more efficient, because determining the definition of a word based on context is much quicker than consulting a dictionary or a thesaurus.
Inductive and deductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning starts with facts and details and moves to a general conclusion. So it lists different details, different examples, and moves to a general conclusion or helps you come to a certain conclusion. Now, inductive reasoning is probabilistic, which means that it's based on probability. You hear certain facts and you come to a conclusion, and that conclusion is going to have some level of probability to it. Now, these conclusions can be strong or weak, and they can be proved false. You could come up with a conclusion that doesn't actually happen. It's not something that's true. But based on the examples you were given or the facts you were given, the conclusion makes sense, even if it's not true. And that's how inductive reasoning works. So let's look at some examples. We have seen 30 white swans, therefore all swans are white. Well, based on the 30 examples that we've seen, this statement makes sense. This conclusion that we drew using inductive reasoning based on our 30 examples would make sense. But is it true? No, not all swans are white. You've got other colors. So this isn't a true thing. This is a false conclusion. But we did use inductive reasoning to get there, basing our conclusion on our examples. Let's look at the next one. Basketball players are tall. John is a basketball player. John must be tall. Well, we don't actually know John, so we're not sure about this one. It's very probable, so this one would be a stronger conclusion than our one about the white swans, but we don't know John. John could be short. John could just be really good at making goals. That doesn't mean that he is going to be a tall person. So it's probable, it's a stronger conclusion, but we don't know for sure. We just use inductive reasoning, knowing that basketball players are generally tall, and knowing that John is a basketball player, to figure out that John is probably tall. This is called bottom-up logic. We start at the bottom with our examples and we build on those facts, details, examples to come to a conclusion. So bottom up to the top to build our conclusion. Next, let's talk about deductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning starts with a conclusion and then explains the facts, details, and examples that support it. So you start with one basic conclusion, one basic statement, and then give facts and details that can support it or that are examples of that statement. This one links premises with conclusions. So you come up with a certain premise and it's linked to your conclusion that you started with. If all premises are true and clear, then the conclusion must also be true. So you start with this one. All dogs are mammals. Okay. All mammals have hearts. Okay. So based on the fact that all dogs are mammals and all mammals have hearts, all dogs must have hearts. So you've got dogs are mammals and mammals have hearts, which means that dogs must have hearts since they are mammals and all mammals have hearts. This is a true conclusion, and that's because all the premises are true. So if all premises are true and clear, then the conclusion must also be true. So on this one, we have true, all dogs are mammals. True, all mammals have hearts. So it's true that all dogs must have hearts. And this one is a true conclusion based on deductive reasoning. Now let's look at example 2. All birds can fly. An ostrich is a bird. All ostriches can fly. So we use the fact that we know all birds can fly and an ostrich is a bird to tell us that an ostrich must be able to fly. So let's look at each of those statements. All birds can fly. Well, that one is false. There are actually about 40 different species of birds that can't fly or are called flightless birds. An ostrich is a bird. Well, that one's true. All ostriches can fly. That one is false. Ostriches are a species of flightless birds. So, since the first sentence was false, the second sentence, our conclusion ended up being false. And that may not always be the case, but whenever you don't have all your premises leading up to your conclusion true, your conclusion might not be true either. Now, we did use deductive reasoning to get there. So even though this is a false conclusion, we were basing it on the information we were given, on the conclusions that were given to us. We came up with this example of an ostrich, and it just wasn't correct. It wasn't true. So over here we had false conclusion, possibly false conclusion, true conclusion, and false conclusion. So using inductive and deductive reasoning is not going to be 100% accurate, but it is going to give you different ways to reason out information you have and try to make a conclusion based on one of these kind of logics. And deductive reasoning is also called top-down logic because you start with known conclusions and work your way to specific examples at the bottom. So you start at the top, known conclusion, work your way down to the bottom to specific examples. So whenever you are trying to figure out a problem or figure out how to connect information that you have, you can use inductive reasoning and deductive reasoning and just make sure that you are paying attention to whether you have facts and details to start with that you can base a conclusion on, or whether you've got broader conclusions that you're going to be coming up with examples for. And remember that they won't always be true. You might still have to go and research whether the conclusion you come up with is accurate or not. Inference. Inferences are conclusions that a reader makes using clues in the text. So an author may not explicitly say something, but they leave little hints behind, and you have to connect the dots to form a conclusion. And inference is different than making a guess because it is based on evidence. So you read, you pick up on those clues or hints that the author leaves behind, and you put them all together to form your inference. So let's look at a couple of examples. Charlotte's toddler is in bed asleep upstairs. She hears a loud thump and then loud crying. So knowing that the toddler is in bed asleep and then hearing a thump and crying, you can infer, or Charlotte can infer when she's at home, that her toddler fell out of bed. Now, our example doesn't say the toddler fell out of bed, and it doesn't say Charlotte ran upstairs and found her child on the floor. But because you know the kid was in a bed sleeping, and then you hear a thump, probably against the floor, and then crying because the kid is hurt or scared from waking up in the middle of the night on the floor unexpectedly, Charlotte can infer that her toddler fell out of bed, or the reader can infer that that's what happened whenever they're trying to process the story and figure out what the author was trying to tell them with these clues. So let's look at another example. Nolan sees cookie crumbs on the floor and chocolate around his son's mouth. So cookie crumbs on the floor, chocolate around his mouth is going to tell you that Nolan's son got into the cookie jar. And it may not be the cookie jar, it may be that he got into a pack of cookies, but you don't really know the rest of that. You just know that if there are cookie crumbs on the floor and chocolate around his son's mouth, that the kid got into cookies somehow. So you can infer he got into a cookie jar or a pack of cookies without the author explicitly saying that to you. And that's all it is. That's all inference is. Reading something and coming to a conclusion. A lot of the times it's really obvious things. If you see a lady come into a store and she's dripping wet and it's raining outside, you can infer that she doesn't have an umbrella. So some things are just common sense. They come to you. You don't even realize you're making an inference. But in the end, an inference is just a conclusion that a reader makes based on evidence. Interpretation of expository or literary text. Well, to determine what your interpretation of a work is going to be, first let's refresh ourselves on what expository and literary text are. Expository writing is going to be something that informs, explains, or describes. It's going to be very cut and dry. There's not a plot. It's basically there to explain something to you, tell you how to do something, give instructions. A science research paper would be an example. Baking instructions for baking a cake. Anything like that would be expository. So what you want to do is outline the basic elements of that paper, and then you want to evaluate their effectiveness. This is how you are going to give your interpretation. Once you outline the basic elements of the research paper or the recipe, then you can evaluate their effectiveness. Did you learn what you were supposed to learn from the research paper? Are you now able to bake a cake following those directions? Very cut and dry. Literary is a little bit different. Literary works are going to be your narratives, essays, works of fiction. These are going to have a plot. There's going to be more that you will have to go through, and because there will be so much more to the literary works, you want to focus on just one aspect to give your interpretation. You don't want to try to cover all of the elements because that would be too much and you wouldn't really get to put your personal interpretation on all of the different aspects of that work. So, some aspects you could choose from are the topic of the story, major characters in the story, major events, the setting, structure, point of view, use of language, or tone. Any of these would work. Pick one, focus on that one, and what you're going to do is explained here. An interpretation should both describe the text and elaborate upon it. So, say we were to choose major characters. You would want to describe what's in the text and elaborate upon it. And I've put that into a few steps here for you. So, to describe the text, introduce the major characters. in your interpretation, describe the major characters. What do they look like? What are their attitudes? How has the author described them in the text? Then, explain how the author portrays them. Are they liked by other characters? Are they meant to be a villain or a hero? Are they just an everyday Joe? How does the author portray these characters? And then discuss what the author's purpose was. Why did the author portray them that way? What did the author want to get across to readers? And because this is an interpretation, there are going to be several different answers. There's no one right answer, because no one is going to know exactly what the author's purpose was. You're giving your interpretation, what you think the author meant. So you'll describe everything that the author put in the book about the characters, and then you'll elaborate upon what the author put in there by telling what you think the author was trying to tell, what the author's theme was, what their purpose was for showing characters in a certain light. So when you are interpreting a text with expository, you want to remember to just outline the basic elements and evaluate their effectiveness. Were you able to bake that cake? Did you learn what you were supposed to from the research paper? With literary works, you want to focus on one aspect. Out of all the different things you could focus on in a literary text, pick one, just one, and then describe that one from the text, what the author actually said, and elaborate upon it. Go through and give your opinion on it, what you think the author meant. And the thing is, it's an interpretation. Everyone's is going to be a little different. Not everyone's going to pick the same aspect to focus on, and not everyone's going to elaborate upon it the same way. So since the author knew he was writing to lots of different readers whenever he or she created this work, try to make your interpretation unique. Interpreting visual representations. When you read a text and interpret it, you're going to read it very closely so that you can draw conclusions based on what you read, and that's how you form your interpretation. The same is true when you're interpreting a visual representation. You can use the text surrounding the visual to help you figure it out, but a lot's going to come from the visual itself. So look closely at the visual. What is the picture actually of? What's trying to be told here? Ask yourself what it is about. What's going on in that picture? What is the tone? Is this picture something that would make you think happy thoughts, sad thoughts, something scary, something neutral, patriotic? What's the tone of this picture? And again, this can be gleaned from the text itself. If you've already read the text and you have an idea of what's going on, the visual may just be supportive. Or if you haven't read the text yet and you just see the visual right away, it may clue you in on what the text is going to be about. You can also ask yourself, why did the author make the artistic representation? Was the author trying to support what they were already saying? Were they trying to make you think about something further? Were they trying to just throw you for a loop by putting something in there that didn't have anything to do with what they were writing? What was their purpose in making this artistic representation in the first place? Are there any symbols? If you saw a picture that had an olive branch or a dove, you may think, oh, this text has something to do with peace. Or if the text had nothing to do with peace, then that symbol may be there ironically, and you may have to think about it to figure out why the author wanted to put something there that didn't go with the text. You could also see an X symbol, which would tell you no or not, especially if it's over something else. Maybe letting you know that's not allowed there. There are lots of different symbols that if you saw them, you'd say, oh, I automatically think of blank. So ask yourself if there's anything like that that comes to mind whenever you see that visual. Is there any persuasion or bias? Is the author trying to show you that they are for or against something else? Are they trying to persuade you that one thing is better than another. An example might be if you're writing an article about being healthy, you may have a picture of a cheeseburger and fries and a soda with a big red X drawn on it, and then a picture of some nice vegetables and a grilled chicken breast in a glass of water and have a big green circle around it or a big green check mark saying this is the right thing to do, the fast food is the wrong thing to do. And just by seeing that picture, you already have an idea of what that text is about, and that the author is having a negative bias toward fast food and a positive bias toward healthy food. Whenever you're looking at these visuals and trying to interpret them, you will likely have to make inferences. Many artistic works are abstract, which means that they leave something to the imagination. You're not going to know what the author meant every time that you see a visual. You're not going to know what the artist meant whenever they wrote it, and so that's where inference comes in. Art can evoke a very emotional gut reaction, and that emotional gut reaction can be used in your interpretation. But everyone is not going to have the same gut reaction. It's going to be different for everyone, and that's what it means by it being abstract and you having to make inferences. Everyone's going to interpret this visual a little bit differently most of the time. There are some that you are automatically going to know what it means. If you saw the fast food with a red X over it, you were going to know, oh, fast food is meant to be bad in this picture. But there are some things, like if you just saw a picture of a bird and the piece had nothing to do with the bird, you would have to infer what it was there for. You would have to think about what your gut reaction was to interpret why the author put that visual in there. So when you're trying to interpret visual representations, look closely at that visual and ask yourself why the author put it there in the first place. What is its purpose? What was the author trying to tell you beyond the text? Prefixes, suffixes, and root words. Have you ever been reading a book and come across a word that you've never seen before? Well, if you can break that word down into prefixes, suffixes, and root words, then you can probably figure out what the word means. For instance, orthography may be a word you've never seen before, but if we break it down into its prefix, ortho, its root word, graph, and its suffix, y, then we might be able to figure out what the word means. Ortho means correct or straight. Graph means write or draw. And y means the state or condition of. So if we put all those together, we can get the state of being written correctly. And when we compare the definition we came up with our actual definition, you can see they're pretty close. The state of being written correctly, writing words using the proper letters. So you got a pretty good idea just by breaking the words down into a prefix, a root word, and a suffix and figuring out what those meant. And even if you only knew graph had something to do with writing, you would have an idea that orthography had to do something with writing. Let's look at another example. Geometric. We'll break down into our prefix, geo, our root word, metra, and our suffix, ik. Geo means earth, and we put that with metra, which means measure, and ik means having to do with. So, if we put all of those together, we can come up with having to do with measuring the earth. Now this one isn't quite as close to the actual definition, relating to the branch of mathematics that has to do with measuring points, lines, and angles, but it does have measuring in there. You would be able to tell from the root word measure that geometric is going to have something to do with measuring. So if you ever come across a word that you don't know, First, try to figure out what the prefix is, the root word is, and the suffix is, so that you can maybe get an idea of what the word means. You can see how important prefixes, suffixes, and root words are to understanding what a word means.
Reading comprehension is extremely important. Oftentimes you'll be tested for what you read, so it's important that you understand what you are reading. I have some simple reading comprehension tips written up here on the board that I want to go over. The first is read when you are not tired. This is different times of day for different people, but for the most part this means do not read at night because you're going to be tired from the day's activity. Oftentimes people cannot read in the morning either because they are groggy from just having woken up. So make sure you read at a time when you are very alert. Read for short time intervals. Don't try to read for an hour or two at a time because you're going to get tired of reading and not retain what you read. Try to read for 30 to 45 minutes, take a break, and then read again. Read in a distraction-free environment. Get somewhere where your eyes and ears are not distracted. This means somewhere where there is not a lot of activity and where it is quiet so that you can solely focus on reading. Comprehend what you read. It's very easy to read a page and for your eyes to move down the page, but for your thoughts to be elsewhere. Stop and ask yourself as you are reading, what am I reading and why this is important? Because you wouldn't want to get to the end of a book and not have understood anything of the book and have to reread it. So make sure you're comprehending the book as you read it. Skim what you are about to read first. This means skimming the chapter, reading a title page, reading the preface and introduction, reading a chapter summary, and then reading the chapter in its entirety. Take advantage of the way a textbook is structured. Oftentimes a textbook will have major headings, italicized words, and words in bold. These are important points that you should take note of. Oftentimes chapters will have a list of important points at the end and a chapter summary. Read those as well, as those re-emphasize the important points of the chapter. So next time you read, remember these reading comprehension tips so that you can retain more of what you read. A suffix is a part of a word that is added onto the end of a root word and cannot stand alone. So many times in a word, you have a prefix, a root, and a suffix. And so the prefix, the root word, and the suffix all combine to make one word. Now sometimes you only have a root word, sometimes you just have a prefix and a root word, and sometimes you just have a root word and a suffix, and sometimes you really just have a prefix and a suffix. But you're never just going to find a prefix and you're never just going to find a suffix. It has to be paired with something else. Now a suffix has a meaning of its own, and so it changes or enhances the meaning of the root word that is added to it. And so it forms a new word with a little bit of a different meaning. So we have the word happy. Now we also have a suffix, which is N-E-S-S. Now this line right here means that it's a suffix. If the line was after the word, it would mean that it's a prefix. But right here, this means it's a suffix, meaning the root word comes before it. So now if we combine happy and ness, we get the word happiness. And so we know what the root word means. We know what it means to be happy or joyful. But ness right here means the state of. So the suffix right here changes the meaning of happy to mean the state of being happy. So you can say that person is experiencing happiness. You wouldn't say they're experiencing happy, but you would say they're experiencing happiness. Now, think about the word geometry. You may not even be familiar with this word, but you're probably familiar with some of the parts of it. So we have geo, which is the prefix right here, and so that means earth. So I'm just going to write that right here. Geo means earth. And then we have this right here, M-E-T-R-I, which means the measure of. It's kind of similar to the word meter. And then we have the suffix IC, which means having to do with. So we can come up with a definition here that means having to do with measuring the earth, because we have these definitions of the parts of the word, so we combine it into one approximate definition. Now, if you were to look up this word in the dictionary, you would find that the dictionary definition is of or relating to the branch of mathematics that has to do with measuring points, lines, and angles. So by using the definitions of each section of the word, we weren't necessarily able to define exactly the definition of this, but we were able to get a general idea. Now, think about the word ophthalmology. So with this word right here, we have this first part of it, which comes from the word ophthalmos, which means eye. And then we have the suffix right here, which is ology, which you've probably heard of a lot. Zoology, ecology, geology. And ology means the study of. So again, we can come up with an approximate definition. So this must mean the study of the eye. And so an ophthalmologist is someone who studies the eye. And so it's a doctor who deals with eye problems and does eye surgeries. So if you just looked at ophthalmology and thought that's the study of the eye, you're not getting an exact definition what ophthalmology is, but you're getting an idea that it's the study of the eye and the problems with it. And so there's definitely going to be a more specific definition of it, but you're able to get a general idea of what it's talking about. Now, a couple of the suffixes we looked at here were ness, ick, and ology. And there are many more suffixes. And so if you're able to learn the meaning of some of the suffixes, then you can oftentimes just look at a word and figure out what it means. Another thing you can do, say, for example, like I said earlier, say you saw the word zoology. And so you don't necessarily know what this means. Say you don't know that ology means the study of. But you have heard of the word geology, and you know that means the study of the earth or of rocks. And so you can look at this right here and think, okay, ology must mean the study of, and I've heard of the word zoo, that's a place with a lot of animals, so zoology must mean the study of animals. So think about words that are like this word, think about words that have the same suffix, and think about the definitions of that word, and then that way you can figure out the definition of the word in question. So again, a suffix is a part of a word that is added onto the end of a root word and cannot stand alone.
Textual evidence for predictions. A prediction is an educated guess about what will come later in a text. Now, your predictions can be about an event or about how a character will behave. But any prediction you make must be based on information in the text or based on knowledge about literature in general. For instance, if you've seen how a character has acted in a story so far, you can make a prediction about his future actions. And with your knowledge about literature, you know the basic layout of a mystery novel, so you might be able to predict who did something in a story or how the story is going to end up based on your general knowledge of literature. And the more you read, the more your general knowledge about literature is going to increase, so you may be able to make more predictions the more you read. Now, one specific way that you might find textual support for prediction is with foreshadowing. And foreshadowing is when the author hints at something that will occur later in the plot. So sometimes it's subtle. Sometimes the author doesn't say exactly what will happen. It may mention storm clouds on the horizon, and the storm clouds could equal danger or something bad happening. So if you have a character who is going through a tough time and then they see storm clouds on the horizon, or someone mentions a storm might be coming, then that may be the author's way of hinting that something bad is coming or danger is approaching. However, sometimes foreshadowing could be more direct, as in Romeo and Juliet. They talk about how they would rather die than live without one another. And that was William Shakespeare's way of hinting that in the end, when they thought that they might live without one another, they did end up killing themselves rather than live without the other one. Sometimes foreshadowing comes in the form of a fortune teller. There are a lot of stories that include a fortune teller or someone that happens to tell someone's fortune or tell their future even without being labeled a fortune teller. And they'll say exactly what's going to happen, and then later on, that's how the plot unfolds. Now, sometimes the author will throw in what's called a red herring. And that's when they tell you what's going to happen, but it doesn't really happen. So, when a hint or prediction by the author does not actually happen. So, you have to pay attention because sometimes the author may give you a direct foreshadowing example. They may go and say exactly what's going to happen, and that'll be true. But sometimes they'll give a really big hint, or they'll even lay out the prediction with a fortune teller or by the characters just discussing how they feel like things are going to end up. But it's a red herring because that's not really how the author ends the story. So don't always think that if the author tells you something's going to happen, it's going to happen. But foreshadowing can often be a good textual support for any predictions you're going to make. So whenever you are making predictions while you're reading a story, make sure that your predictions are based on evidence either from the story itself, information in that text, or information that you've gained from reading other books and getting a general knowledge about literature. Textual support for interpretation. Whenever you're going to interpret a work, you are going to identify the author's methods, their tone, their use of language, their plot, major characters, setting. Then you're going to decide on one of those aspects of the writing, pick just one, and evaluate and analyze that one aspect. You want to give your opinion on what the author was trying to do with the use of this character or with the use of a certain tone. What was their purpose in doing that? But you want to make it stronger. And one way that you can make your evaluation, your interpretation of this work stronger is to root your interpretation in the text. That means you go through and you find specific examples in the text that support what your interpretation is. The examples from the text support your ideas. So it doesn't look like it's just things that you're coming up with out of your head. It's things that you came up with because of something specific in the story that made you think. So one thing you can look at is quotes. Look at what characters say. This could be something that affects the tone, or it could be something that reflects on a character, or it could be something specific letting you know what's happening in the plot. Look at details from the story. It could be how someone looks, so physical characteristics. It could be specific things that happen in the plot. It could have to do with the tone as well. It could have to do with specific language that the author used. But find those details and then put them into your evaluation. Find these quotes and put them into your interpretation. So if you're trying to describe how a character acts or how you felt about a character, go back and find something specific about that character in the story and put it into your interpretation so that your essay now has roots in the text and is going to be stronger. Another thing you can do, which isn't going to pull information directly from the text you read, but is going to make your work stronger, is to find statistics or facts relating to your topic. Now, this could be If you're writing about cell phones, you might say, a lot of people use cell phones. Well, instead of using that general phrase, you could give an actual number of people who use cell phones. Or if it's people using cell phones while driving, or while at home, or while at work, or under or over a certain age, you could look up that statistic and put it into your paper. And it's going to help because it makes things more precise. It shows you did your research. It shows you aren't just making things up from your head. You are actually going out and finding this information somewhere. The same way that you giving your opinion of a character or of the theme of a work is based on the quotes that you find or details that you find in the writing. So whenever you are giving an interpretive essay, you want to find textual support for that interpretation. Identifying the author's methods, finding one aspect to focus on, and evaluating and analyzing that is all important, but to make it even stronger, you want to root your interpretation in the text.
When someone infers something, it means they form a conclusion about something the author has not actually stated by making logical deductions from things he has stated. So, if you were to just read the first part of this definition, you might think that an inference is a guess, because the first part of this definition says forming a conclusion about something the author has not actually stated. So, while that is what an inference is, you also base an inference on things the author has stated. So it's not just something that you're making up. You're basing it on logical reasoning, or you're coming to this conclusion from logical deductions. Basically, you're reading in between the lines. Now, infer is closely related to the word imply. Imply and infer are flip sides of the same coin. An author implies something by suggesting it without saying it directly, and then a reader infers what the author is trying to imply. So this passage up here says, the saying that job applicants should dress for success is not far from the truth. An interviewer's first impression of a job candidate will be based on what they see. The interviewer will most likely process a resume in light of that first impression. The nicer someone dresses, the more serious they probably are about a job. So, after you read this passage, you're now faced with a question. The author would most likely agree that. And then you have several options here. So there will be many times when you have to read a passage and then answer a question about it. And so a lot of times the question will be something like the author would most likely agree that, or the researchers would most likely concur with which one of the following, or the argument most strongly supports which one of the following, or which one of the following can be properly inferred from the passage above. Any of those are all relating to this same core question. What can you infer from this passage? So A says women do better than men in interviews. So we have to make a distinction here between things that are true and things that can be backed up by the passage we just read. So women may actually do better than men in interviews. I haven't seen the statistics on it. So just say, for example, that this is true. Women do better than men in interviews. This is still not a correct answer because we're trying to make an inference from this passage up here. And the author never talks about women versus men in interviews. So we cannot go with A. B says interview questions should focus more on achievements than goals. Well, I mean, that makes sense that you should ask a candidate about their past achievements rather than their future goals. But again, there's nothing to back it up, no evidence for that. C says job applicants who dress nicely feel more confident. That sounds good. That's probably true. And that seems to be supported by this. Because you think if you dress for success, then you'll be more confident. That may be what this phrase is kind of saying, is that you'll feel more confident if you dress for success. But nothing else in this passage backs up C. Overall, this passage is not about the job applicant feeling more confident. It's more about the impression their dress gives to a potential employer or the interviewer. So we come to D. So pretty much we can already conclude that D is correct by process of elimination. But we don't want to just stop there. We want to go ahead and dive into this and see if D really is the correct answer. So it says a male job applicant should make sure his tie and shirt match. Now you may be thinking, this passage never talks about matching or ties or shirts, but this is still the correct answer. Because remember, we're talking about making a good first impression. This last sentence says the nicer someone dresses, the more serious they probably are about a job. So one way to dress nice is to be matching. And you match well, and you look nice, you make a good first impression, and you dress for success. So D is the correct answer. Many times it is important to be able to identify two words that are synonyms. Now, some words are perfect synonyms and other words are nearly synonyms. Rarely are you going to find perfect synonyms because you're not going to be able to generally find two words that have the same definition. So generally what you're looking for are two words that are nearly synonyms, meaning they have almost the same definition. So we have the word superfluous up here on the board, which means more than needed. So if I ask you how your day was going, and you said my day has been wonderful, extraordinary, out of this world, unbelievable, I could say that you were being superfluous in your description of your day because you were using more words than needed. So we need to find a synonym that goes along with this word. So we have A, which says senseless. So it is senseless to use more words than needed. So we'll put a star next to A because that could be it. B says unique. Unique and superfluous definitely are not synonyms. We come to C, which says excessive. That's a pretty good synonym for superfluous. D is unwanted. We could say that superfluous means unwanted because if you use more words than necessary, then you could say some of those words are unwanted. But I would say that excessive is a closer synonym than unwanted. So we'll X that out as well. Then we come to E, which means obstinate. That obviously is not a synonym for superfluous. So we come down to senseless and excessive. And so we're not going to find a word that means exactly the same thing as superfluous, but we can find a word that is very close. So we're looking for the closest synonym. And so some people might disagree with me here, but I'm going to say that C is the closest synonym to superfluous. So we're going to go with C, which is the word excessive. So remember, you're not finding two words that have exactly the same definition, but instead you want to go through the words you're provided with and mark off the ones you know are wrong, and then narrow it down a little bit, and then from there decide which word you think is a synonym of the word you're looking at. A reader should look for clues to make predictions about what will happen next in a story. It's important for a reader to make predictions because it helps them analyze what they are reading and better understand everything they are reading. And so there's two ways for a reader to make predictions about what they're reading. And so the first way we already identified, and that's through clues in the story. Many times the author includes clues in the story to help the reader figure out what's going to happen next. And the second way to make predictions is through personal experience. Say, for example, that a character stays in the sun all day. Well, from personal experience, you know that if you stay in the sun all day, you get sunburned. So through personal experience, you can make a prediction that the character is going to get sunburned. Now, suppose there is a story about a boy going swimming, and he swims too far out. And suppose the story says that the boy can't get back to shore, and so he starts to yell. And the lifeguard comes out and helps him. But the story stops after the boy goes back in the water again. Well, even though the story doesn't continue, as a reader, you might be able to predict that the boy won't swim out as far this time because he almost drowned when he swam out that far last time. Now, this prediction may not be true, but it is the most likely thing to happen. So let's read this story right here and analyze it. When Glenn is sick, his mother keeps him home from school. He stays in bed all day and takes medicine. Glenn woke up this morning with a sore throat. His head was hot, and he felt achy. So what usually happens when Glenn is sick? His mother keeps him home from school. Well, Glenn woke up this morning with a sore throat, and his head was hot, and he felt achy. We can conclude then that he's sick, because when you're sick, you know that a lot of times you have a sore throat, you feel hot, and your body kind of aches. And so from this, even though we can predict that his mother's going to keep him home from school, and he's going to have to stay in bed all day and take medicine. Now, we don't actually know what happens next, because see, the story stops right here. But yet, from clues in the story, we can predict what will happen next. Now, there are some other ways to make predictions. You can also use text features to help locate information to make predictions and verify conclusions determined about different text. So you could use keywords as clues. So you could look for keywords here like sick or home, school, things like that to make these predictions. You can also look for bold print words. If any words are in bold, there's none here, but in other stories there may be words in bold, underlined words, or words in italics. And so make sure that you pay attention to those words, and that'll help you make predictions about a text.
In this video, we want to go over prefixes. Prefixes are short little sections of words that come before the root of a word and help you understand what the word means. They add an extra nuance to the word. And why prefixes and suffixes, for that matter, are important, prefixes coming before the root of the word, suffixes, short little endings after the word, is that if you know your basic prefixes and suffixes, they help you determine the meaning of a word. And they're important clues, especially if you're taking a standardized test where they say we want you to find the word with the opposite meaning. Sometimes just knowing the prefix can give you enough of a clue, even if you don't know what the root means, to find the opposite. We've got a few examples on the board and we want to go through those briefly just to show you the importance of prefixes, how they can help you in your test-taking strategies, and how they can help you understand the meanings of words. So prefixes give clues as to a word's meaning. Knowing them can help you find the word with the opposite meaning on a test. So words like prefixes like pre. Here we think pre-operative, pre-op. That means before the operation. Or prescient. Pre meaning before, and scient from the word science, which means knowledge. So to know ahead of time. So prescient is to know ahead of time. Pre-game show, the part that comes before the game. So pre means before. The opposite of pre is post. Post-operative care, the care that happens after the operation. Post-game show, the show that happens after the game. So pre is before, post is after. If you realize this opposites, then if you see a word that's got a pre prefix on it, then you look for a word with a post prefix on it if the test is asking you to find the opposite. Another thing would be pro and d. So pro means for, as in pro-life. Someone who is pro-life is for life. De is the negation, so deconstruction. To deconstruct is the opposite of, or the negation of construction. Construction to build up, deconstruct to destroy. So pro meaning for, de is usually a negation, pre before, post after. Knowing your prefixes can be critical, especially if you're not sure of the whole word. You can say, well, let me break this word up into its prefix, its root, and its suffix, and see if I can't decode just from that minimal information the proper answer on the other side. Now, obviously, when you're taking a test, if you know the right answer, you always go with the right answer. But if you're struggling, if you're not sure, this is a strategy you can use. You can look at the word, break it down, and say, here's the prefix, and I know it means this, and I'm being asked to find the opposite. What's the opposite of this prefix? Then I've got my answer more than likely. Caution though, caution. Con and pro are opposites, but congress is not the opposite of progress, although some people might disagree. That's more of a joke in terms of Congress being the opposite of progress, but con and pro are opposites, but you have to know and be careful sometimes. Anyway, that's been just a basic introduction and overview of the importance of prefixes as a test-taking strategy of knowing what they mean to help you determine the meaning of a word, and also to assist you if you're being asked to look for the opposite. If you know what the prefix means and you know what the opposite of that prefix is, it makes it a snap to find the right answer. If you'd like to learn more about this or related matters, underneath this video you'll see a link. If you'll click on that link, it'll take you to the website that has that information. While you're on that website, you'll also find a link to an ebook that's ready for immediate download.
Noticing an author's position is very vital to understanding a piece of writing, because every writer is going to have a personal bias, or they're going to have a certain position on whatever they're writing about. So the way they portray something in their writing may not be totally accurate. So it's vital that you as a reader understand the author's position so that you can better understand their work of writing. So first of all, the author's position is basically their stance on the issue at hand. It's what they believe about the issue they are writing about. So to help you find the author's position, you need to notice several things. Notice each point here starts with the word notice, because to find the author's position, you can't just sit back and have it come to you. You as the reader are going to have to be proactive and notice these things. So first of all, notice personal opinions. So this is basically noticing when someone is interjecting their own thoughts about something instead of actually putting fact in there. Notice bias. This is when someone words a sentence or a paragraph so that they portray something as being good or maybe portray something else as being bad. In other words, they're not giving fact anymore. The way they word something casts something into a negative light or makes something look very good or very positive. Also, notice emotional language. This is when a writer puts their own thoughts into something or their own opinions into something, and then by using strong emotional language, tries to sway the reader over to their thinking. Now remember, again, we're not talking about a persuasive paper, because persuasive papers are always going to have a certain author's position in it, because that's the idea of a persuasive paper, that the author is trying to sway you a certain way. So we're not focusing on persuasive papers, focusing on other kinds of papers when the author really isn't supposed to have a bias, when they're not supposed to have a position on the issue. But nevertheless, they are going to have a position. And so sometimes they'll insert emotional language to try to persuade someone to their thinking. Then also, notice what information is left out. Because when we're talking about personal opinions, bias, and emotional language, these are all things that are going to be added to the paper. This is something an author may add to the paper to insert their bias or to insert their own position. But noticing what is left out is when the author doesn't write something to support their position. This may be some fact that would look bad upon their own position, so they just leave it out. So sometimes it's hard to know what is left out because it's not there. And if you don't know anything else about the topic at hand, you may not know what pertinent information is being left out. But sometimes that can be helpful to understanding the author's position. So the important thing to take away from this is that the author's position is their stance on the issue at hand. In any piece of writing that is out there, the author who wrote it is going to have a position on that subject. So it's up to you as the reader to determine how strong that position is portrayed in the paper, and to notice anytime anything is skewed or the facts are twisted a little bit, and when the author is trying to persuade you to believe like they do. When a reader comes across an unfamiliar word, it's important that they know techniques to understanding the word's definition. One way to determine a word's definition is by looking at the prefix and suffix of the word. Although there are many words in the English language, many of those words share a common prefix or suffix. So by understanding the meaning of that prefix or suffix, the reader can then determine the likely meaning of the word. So one way to determine word meaning is structural analysis, and that's by looking at the prefix, the root, and the suffix, all of a word. So take the word unacceptable, for example. Here you have the root word, accept. Because that can be a word in itself. And then here you have the prefix, un, and the suffix, able. The prefix is always going to come before the root word, and the suffix is always going to come after the root word. Now, notice I said the root word is the word that can stand alone. I understand that able can also stand alone and is a word, but in this case it's a suffix. So if you saw un or able written by themselves, you would see it written like this. That's because the dash represents the word. So here, since un is a prefix, the word comes after the prefix. And here with able, the word comes before able because able is the suffix. So say you didn't understand what unacceptable meant. Well, you could look at able, and you know that means able pretty much. And so you know acceptable must mean able to accept. Well, un, you know, means not so from words like unprofessional, because unprofessional means not professional. It means the opposite of. So you know that un means not acceptable. It's something that's not able to be accepted. So thereby using the prefix and the suffix of the word and knowing the meanings of those, the reader can determine the meaning of the word unacceptable. Now some words like backward don't have both a prefix and a suffix. They just have a suffix. So back is the root word and word is the suffix. So say you didn't know what backward meant, but you knew what the root word meant. You knew what back meant. But you remember the word toward, which also has the same suffix. And you know that means going somewhere. So you could get an idea that this suffix has something to do with direction. So since you see the root word back, you know it means going back to. And so that's another example of how to use the prefix or the suffix to determine the meaning of the word. And some words just have a prefix. This word, for example, has a prefix and a suffix, but no root word. Here, bio is a prefix and ology is also a suffix. And they share that O. And so you could look at this and think, okay, I don't know what this means, but I know I've seen the word bio before and the word biography. Well, that's a book about someone's life. So bio must mean life. And then what does ology mean? Well, I've heard of archaeology, and so that must mean the study of something because you're studying something. So ology means the study of. So by knowing the prefix and the suffix and what they mean of this word, you can conclude that this word most likely means the study of life. So it's important to understand common prefixes and suffixes so that you can determine the meaning of an unfamiliar word. Every piece of writing should have a logical conclusion, and it's your job as the reader to identify that conclusion, mainly for the purpose of helping you to understand whether you agree with the writer or not. Because you don't want to just read a piece of literature, you want to analyze it. So one step in that process to better understanding it is identifying the conclusion to know whether you agree with the writer or not. So now I want to talk about how to identify that conclusion. So you're going to need to infer a lot, or make an inference. And to infer something just means to take what you already know and combine it with something else to draw a conclusion. So it's pretty self-explanatory. And so what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to combine two things. What you already know with the info or the information found in the text. So I'm going to draw a double arrow there because to make an inference, you're pulling these two things together, everything you find in the text, any pre-knowledge you have, and you're pulling that together to draw the conclusion. And generally, a conclusion should be obvious. If a writer does a good job in their writing, then the conclusion should be easily identifiable. Otherwise, you may draw a conclusion that is not the conclusion the writer had in mind. But nevertheless, it's important that you as the reader analyze the writing and identify the logical conclusion. A logical fallacy is a poor argument made by a writer, or an argument that is not totally accurate. It's important that you, as a reader, are able to identify these logical fallacies so that you won't fall into the trap of believing the writer's arguments. So I want to take a look at some examples up here on the board of some logical fallacies. The first is the overgeneralization tactic. Take this sentence, for example. Everybody knows she is a terrible teacher. This is an overgeneralization because everyone does not believe she is a terrible teacher. Probably many people believe she is a terrible teacher, but not everyone. So a writer may use this tactic when they don't have a good argument, and so they use large generalizations or exaggerations to make their argument look good. The second fallacy is the slippery slope, and this is the idea that if one thing happens, something else will automatically happen. Take this sentence, for example. If you study hard, you will ace the test. While studying hard may help you ace the test, it does not necessarily mean that you will indeed ace the test. So this is an example of a slippery slope. The third logical fallacy is hasty generalizations. This is basically drawing a conclusion too early without totally analyzing everything. So you as a reader need to look out for these logical fallacies because writers will use these intentionally or unintentionally. But you as a writer, or you as a reader, need to be aware of these logical fallacies so that you don't fall into the trap of believing their arguments. Reading Comprehension, 4th grade. when it comes to summarizing text, you need to be able to state the main point of a story. So a summary is just stating the main point of a story. So you're reading an entire story, and then you're just taking the important things and writing about that. If you've ever looked at the back of a book, you'll see a summary on the back of a book. And so there's a whole book that may be 100 or 200 pages, but the author summarizes it on the back of the book so that you get an idea of what it's about. So that's what you're trying to do through a summary. So there's 4 main points that you should remember when writing a summary. Focus, like I already said, on the main idea of the story. Focus on the key points. In other words, you're not worried about little details. You're worried about the important things that contribute to the overall storyline. The third point is focus on the conclusion of a story. Because in most stories, there's some kind of problem. The whole plot is based around some kind of problem throughout the story. Then eventually that problem is resolved. And so that happens in the conclusion of the story. So look at the conclusion of the story and talk about that too in your summary. So you're going to be talking about the main idea of the story, the key points, the problem, maybe a little bit about the main character, and then talk about the end of the story and how the character ended up dealing with his or her problem. Then the fourth point is kind of a longer one. Focus on important information the author wants the reader to know. So throughout the story, you may notice certain points that the author really wants the reader to understand. And so look for that important information and conclude that in the summary as well. And so a summary is typically 1 paragraph in length. So it's not very long because it does not need to be long because you're not focusing on details, you're just focusing on the overall story. And so remember, again, you're looking for important information. And so we're not interested in details. Try not to even think about the details, just look for the main idea of the story. Now, in some cases, you might be writing a summary for a long story with multiple settings and scenes. And so a summary may be a few paragraphs in length, and these paragraphs give the main points of each major part of the story. And so the summary of a long story always includes a conclusion to wrap up the story as an entirety. So like I said, the summary is usually going to be 1 paragraph, but if it's a really long story that has lots of different settings, lots of different scenes, lots of different problems throughout the plot, you may need to write a paragraph for each main point or major part of the story. And then for that summary, you're going to write a few paragraphs, and then you're going to write a conclusion that's going to kind of summarize that whole story. And so only make a summary longer than 1 paragraph if you feel like you cannot include all the important information in 1 paragraph. So again, a summary states the main point of a story. Supporting details are very important parts of a paper. It can be said that the topic and main idea of a paper is the most important part. But without supporting details, main ideas and topics are irrelevant. So basically, supporting details reinforce a larger point. So a writer will make a point which may take the form of a topic or a main idea of a paper. So the writer makes that point, and then the writer backs up their point with supporting details. And these details are most often found in informative and persuasive text. And this makes sense because if the writer is telling you about something, each main point they make, they're also going to need to back up with more points so that the reader can be sure that they are being told accurate information. Then also in a persuasive text, if the writer is trying to get the reader to do something or to think a certain way, the writer can't just make a bunch of points. They're going to have to back up those points so that the reader will indeed think that way or take that action that the writer wants them to take. And supporting details are often easy to spot because the writer will let you know that those details are coming. A lot of times they'll make a main point and then they'll say something like first, and they'll make us give a supporting detail and second, and give another supporting detail and then say finally, and then give the third supporting detail. Or they might say something like for example or for instance, and that would tip you off that the next supporting detail is coming along. Supporting details need to be two things. They need to be both factual and relevant. Because if something is totally accurate and factual, but it's not relevant to the main idea, then it's no good. The supporting detail needs to be accurate and needs to relate back to the main idea. And if a supporting detail is very relevant, if it pertains to the main idea, but is not accurate, then again, it's no good, because what good is information that is not true? So the important thing to remember with supporting details is that basically their job is to reinforce a larger point, and they can be most often found in informative and persuasive text. They're often easy to spot because they're preceded by words like first, second, finally, or for instance, or for example. And the most important thing for details to be is both factual and relevant. Reading comprehension, 7th grade. In some circumstances, it's important to be able to synthesize text. So what we're going to do is we're going to read this story, and then we're going to work on synthesizing or paraphrasing it. So we'll get to that in a minute, but first let's read this story. So Emmanuel went swimming in the lake by his house, where the water reached a depth of 20 feet in the middle. He did not venture out more than 6 feet into the water, however. So now we want to paraphrase this, which means stating the author's ideas in the reader's own words. So what we're doing here is kind of like a summary, and in fact you may have already thought, oh, that sounds just like summarizing it. But it's a little bit different, because a summary typically involves including the main points of a longer text, such as a novel or full story. Well, this is not a full story, and it's definitely not a novel. It's just a couple sentences. So when you paraphrase, you're taking a couple sentences or an entire paragraph, and you're including the main point of the text being reviewed, because that's what the reader needs to know about the text. So in this example up here, the reader needs to know that Emmanuel went swimming in the lake, but not more than 6 feet out. Those are the important points. It's not really important that the reader understands that the water reaches a depth of 20 feet. So we want to focus on the main points here to kind of summarize it, but in other words, just take a couple sentences and state it in our own words. And so in this case, a good paraphrase would be Emmanuel went swimming 6 feet out in the lake by his house. Emmanuel went swimming 6 feet out in the lake by his house. So that's a paraphrase of this up here. We're just taking the main points, taking those points and expressing them in our own words. And so this right here incorporates the main points that the audience needs to know. Text evidence is basically information in a text that backs up the main point or points in general throughout the story. So I want to write up some main points up here about text evidence. So like I said, it supports. The things it supports are the main point or the points throughout the story. So anytime an author makes a claim about something, it's important that they have text evidence, because when they just make a claim, it's not very credible. And so they add text evidence to it to back up that claim, maybe give a statistic or tell something else to back up the main point or points throughout the story. And text evidence also helps the reader draw a conclusion, or it leads to the conclusion throughout the story. So it's important that text evidence is three things: precise, descriptive, and factual. Remember I said that text evidence supports the main point or points in a story. Well, generally a main point and points throughout a piece of writing are going to be very general. They're not going to be very specific. So since these things are very general, it's important that there are some specifics in the paper. So that's why the text evidence needs to be precise. That way your paper isn't vague, or the writer's paper isn't vague. It's also important that this text evidence is descriptive, because again, main points and points are vague, so it's important to have something very descriptive. And it's also important that they're factual, because since the text evidence is backing up or supporting the main points and points, it's important that these facts, or this text evidence, is factual, so that it's actually credibly backing up the main points and points throughout the story.